talking to them, and then even just at that age, I guess from just seeing the interactions of that, to know it's like there's a place people go for help with this problem of drinking. You know, there's a place people can go to get help. And so like my 5-6-year-old self, like, what is this guy sleeping on this sidewalk for? Why?
And why is my dad so willing to help him? I'm grateful, and I'm sure you are, and so many of us are, and your dad came to this realization. You can delude yourself all you want, and reframe it, and cast it in a seemingly different, more flattering light. The fact of the matter is, it'll never be different. The power of craving, the phenomenon of craving, the allergic reaction, it'll never be different.
That's what recovery looks like, is being of service to others and helping other people and helping to get them sober, and, you know, just being in community and making those connections and doing all of those things. Welcome to the Why Intervention Podcast. I am your host, Christopher Doyle, today joined by one of my oldest friends, my friend John Ronayne. JR is here with us today, and JR was one of the very first, and when I say one of the very first, I mean the very first interview I've ever done. He's the only person I've ever invited back for another one, and so it's really great to have you here, JR. Thank you for doing this again.
No, again, thank you for the opportunity. I remember that podcast interview we did. I believe it was in like February of 2019 or 18, like way back then.
Yep.
And I've seen, obviously, most, if not all, of your video iterations of this. And happy to, you know, put a name to the voice or face to the voice.
Yeah,
so,
right. Because we weren't doing video back then in the early days. It was just
not.
audio, right?
Yes, that's
right.
exactly right. So grateful for the opportunity to connect. You know, absolutely a privilege.
And I love the fact that you were just like, yeah, I think February 2019. That's one of the reasons why I really wanted to have you on here, because you're one of the most brilliant minds that I know, but also just a mind like a steel trap. You know, your memory is just so solid and so great. And this, you know, I've done a number of Mother's Day kind of episodes, Mother's Day specials, but I've never done one focused on fathers. And for whatever reason, it just kind of occurred to me that I'd love to do an episode on my father, you know, like just a kind of like tribute episode, and something where I think about my kids and, you know, like what they're not going to get to have the privilege of hearing my father tell the stories that he told. Right. And so the only way they're going to get to hear those stories is if they hear them from me. But the real, you know, kind of gems and the wisdom that my father had that was really so special was the stuff that I heard from him when I was in early recovery, right? When I was first getting sober, to see him up in the front of a room and share his, you know, experience, strength, and hope, as they say. And he goes into 20, 25 minutes of his background and all of the various different things that he had been through. Well, that's an entirely different perspective for, you know, at the time I was 17 years old in early recovery, to get to, you know, hear my father's story. And I know that you were, you know, in Rockaway, sober at that time as well. And so I just thought that we'd be able to kick it back and forth, share some of the stories and some of the stuff that I know about him, and maybe throw in some stuff also. And, you know, it would be a fun back and forth in that way.
No, again, an honor, a privilege. One thing I want to reference real quick, just because it's topical and of the moment, you mentioned, you know, your Mother's Day content. I had the privilege, and I don't throw that word around loosely, I had the privilege of listening to your mom qualify at the meditation meeting just 4 days ago. And, you know, 50 years, she just celebrated 50 years a few months back. And God, the level of insight, the serenity, the calm, it was a meditation meeting. Like her voice was just so soothing, the insights so deep and profound and, you know, laced with humility. It was, you know, I love that meeting, but to hear her at that meeting was a particularly resonant experience. And it's 4 days later and it's still kind of landing with me. But in terms of Jimmy D, yeah, you know, we're all an arm's length away. We're all drunks, but some are just a little bit more legendary than others, whether that's based on time, number of people helped, the lasting impact. Jimmy, he was probably the most tenured member of what was the home group I joined back in April of 2000. And I was probably 3.5 years sober at the time, having just relocated from the Midwest, came back home and joined the Third Step Good Orderly Direction group, which I believe started in 1987. So the group at that point was 13 years old. And had a very, very small core membership, and your dad was among those members. And to this day, here in 2025, it's been my home group since that April of 2000, so literally 25 years. His spirit still hangs over that group. And whenever we're in business meetings, and I've now aged into becoming the longest tenured member of that group, so I guess that's a good thing and a bad thing all at once, but grateful for the opportunity. But even sometimes in business meetings when, say, the conversation can get a little frisky, and sometimes people are looking to me to weigh in as a tenured member, I literally, WWJD, what would Jimmy do? What would he say? How would he handle it? Because I watched him, I'm not going to say preside because none of us preside, but I watched him serve at business meetings with a calmness and a wisdom and a spiritual engagement, but at the same time, a human remove from what was being discussed or whatever the issue was. And I still borrow from that example when I'm present at a business meeting. And any chance I get, whether it's during a share, if I have the opportunity to qualify in front of that room, like I'll always find an excuse or an opportunity to invoke his name and that's just that one group. Obviously, you talk about the Rockaway recovery community as a whole, and it's a small but vibrant community. And every day or every month, there's less and less people who might have had the privilege of knowing him or meeting him or having heard from him. If I remember correctly, he passed away in 2010. So that's 15 years ago. In those 15 years, many of our members have moved on to the great meeting in the sky, and they've been backfilled by many new members who obviously know you often probably more pertinently through the lens of your mom, which is a pretty powerful, impactful lens. But, he's in you as well. And so whenever I get the opportunity, I just remember how welcoming and humble and attractive he was as I was coming as a 3.5-year newcomer joining that group in the spring of 2000.
Yeah. And that time frame, so spring of 2000, let's see. So that's
just about turned 17 because you're May.
Right. Which means I'm close to getting sober. So if I go back a couple of years then to maybe 93, 95, somewhere around there.
Okay.
So he must have had, I think, 8 years. I think he had 8 years sober.
I know. I'm sorry to cut you off, but I know he'd been around. I think he might have had a small relapse in 87, maybe cocaine related, if I remember correctly. I think
83.
83.
Yeah.
No, 83 is when you were born.
Right. And that's when the relapse started.
Oh, okay. And then in 87, I know his time was 87. Exactly. I remember his anniversary, I believe, was in August.
Perfect.
It was in August of 87. Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
I mean, this is incredible. You got the dates down pat.
Yes.
So August of 95, I was 12. And I remember being at his anniversary meeting, and my godfather, also my godfather just because he's, John Rogan, guy who's, sober and was just friends. I don't believe so. No, he moved up to Maine and he's been gone for many years.
What about on Earth? Is he still with us on Earth or?
I believe so.
But in Maine.
Yeah.
Got it.
But in Maine,
okay.
Right. But I think he spoke, and, the point, I'm not exactly sure what the details were of Dad's whole story at that time, other than to just kind of grasp the magnitude of everything that the man had been through. To now have 8 years sober, and for me to be cogent enough at 12 years old to, at the end of that meeting, say, Dad, I'm really proud of you, for where you are. That it was the first time that this whole thing kind of clicked for me of, this is hard. I've been going to meetings with him since I'm 5 years old.
Yep. I remember you've shared that, yes.
And so at 12, it was the first time that I had some kind of sense of what was really going on and what he had been through, and the fact that he was sober and living this kind of life and the impact he was having on so many people, right?
Definitely.
Was I'm really proud of you.
No, that's a powerful moment for a child to experience, I imagine, especially with a parent who wasn't in the home, right? So to see him in his quote unquote natural habitat, I think was probably very resonant for you. And obviously you've got this wonderful shining example in your mom who, every day and probably on a more organic level was embodying the principles of the program. But, your dad was kind of close to my parents' age, but I grew up in Rockaway. I know him and maybe some of his siblings and his crowd, in the 70s when I was a little boy. I can remember seeing them like around, and this is pre-recovery and, real stuff, real stuff. So when I came back in 2000, and at that point he had 13 years, he was, unrecognizable from the guy I remember kicking around 116th, in the 1970s. And so obviously recovery from 2000 to 2010, like that's the lens that I view and remember him through.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
So from what I recall from his story, right, at 9 years old, he got his hand caught in an ice chipper because he was working, doing some, like, I don't know, like delivering ice.
As 9-year-olds did back then.
Exactly.
Yes,
Exactly.
yes.
He was born in, 1939.
Okay,
I believe, or
post-depression.
37, 39. Yeah.
Post-depression, parents, greatest generation, a different era, obviously.
Yes.
And a different childhood experience than
100%.
I lived, than you lived, and certainly than our children are living today. Yeah.
Right.
Yep.
Right. So there was a lot of, he's an Irish kid, and was around like Flushing and College Point and then Rockaway Beach. Like those were the areas. And then also in and out of Manhattan a little bit with the kinds of crowds that you would expect Irish folks to be with. But if you were rough and tough and tumble and fighting a lot and things like that.
I think he checks those boxes in those years. Yep.
Yeah. And so he was, in and out of jails. He was in Sing. He was in, what's the other one? The Gomorrah. Attica. He was in Attica. Of course, the story did not match the man that raised me, right? Like this does not compute in a way, but like in total, the total amount of time that he had spent in prisons was cumulatively about 9 years of his life.
That's that's more than 10% of anybody's life, depending on how long they live. But that's
right.
Call it 15% of your life, institutionalized. Yeah.
Yeah. And so he had gotten sober in prison. And I remember one of the funny kind of relapse stories, one of his last stories. And by the way, he was in prison, but I know that one of the last times he got arrested was because he got, arrested on a breaking and entering. And this is one of the things that for families that are listening or anybody, it's like, it's a sad kind of tragic thing when you start to go down this road. He probably had who knows how many dozens of arrests, right? So once you have a rap sheet that long, it doesn't matter what the last thing was.
It's the body. It's the body of work.
Exactly. And so he got arrested on a breaking and entering because he was trying to get into his brother Edmund's house, and he picked the wrong house.
The Robert Downey Jr.
Yeah. He broke the door and he passed out in the vestibule of the house and was arrested.
Oh wow!
And then he goes away.
Because of the rap sheet, I guess, probably, if there's benefit of a doubt, he wasn't getting it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So now he's in prison and he's getting sober. And
what years were those, if you don't mind my asking? Yeah.
We're going back too far.
It predates you, yeah.
It's got to be 60s, 70s,
okay.
Right? Like that kind of time frame.
Pre-Debbie, obviously.
Yes, because the other thing about his story is he was sober for 11 years, coming up to 83.
Okay, so he got sober in 72. Okay.
Yeah, so there you go. So prior to that was when he was arrested and he went away for who knows how many years, and he'd gotten sober. But I remember him telling this story about how he came out and he was sober. And he was feeling good about being sober. And he's getting on, the bus to leave. And one of the other guys gets released the same day. And the guy says, so what are you going to do now? And he's like, well, I'm just going to go back to the neighborhood. And he's like, well, we should get some rum. And my father said, no. That's what put me in here. And he says, we should get some vodka. And then they go and they get a bottle each. And my father just starts drinking.
Just like
right
that.
Away.
Just like that.
Like not even a thought, right? So it was kind of instructive in how baffling and confusing and how insane that could be, right? And then he's telling the story about how he's, on the boardwalk wearing his, whatever the prison greens or the prison orange, whatever he was wearing, and combat boots. And he's so delirious that, planes are flying into JFK and he thinks he's landing the planes. He's standing on a bench on the boardwalk and he's doing the wave in like he's landing the planes, And then he crawls up into a police car
This is incredible, by the way.
Go to sleep.
This is incredible. Okay.
Yeah. He crawls into a police car, in the backseat of a police car because it was snowing, not realizing it's a police car. And he just sleeps in the backseat of the police car.
Just like he didn't realize it wasn't his brother's house years earlier.
Exactly.
Yep.
And so he winds up getting away with that. And I don't know what then led to or how it was that he got sober in the 70s. But what I do know is that's when, obviously, he meets my mother.
Yep. And I know my Uncle Willie, who passed away 2 years ago, was a super active AA member from 71 on. And I know they were, quote unquote, running buddies, in the 70s, the 1970s, mutton chops, Rockaway AA community, whatever that looked like, or the messaging was the same, but the look and the vibe was probably a little different, let's be honest. But I know, because when I came back, I think based on Willie's work with your dad, that's probably helped me be just a little bit more warmly received. Besides the fact that's who he was, but the fact that he knew I was related to someone who was instrumental in his early recovery in this circa 1970s Rockaway.
Right. Yep. Smoking Carlton 100s.
Well, why wouldn't you? Of course.
Yeah. Traipsing about the community. But they were, helping a lot of people. And that's where he, developed this reputation, really, that he was that's what recovery looks like, is being of service to others and helping other people and helping to get them sober and, just being in community and making those connections and doing all of those things. And I think that's kind of what contributes to, the depth of the kind of spiritual connection in the community, or like the respect that people would have, because even though he had a relapse when my mother was pregnant with me, and it lasted from 83 then until about 87. Yeah. It's not like that work goes away. It's not like that well-intentioned, good-natured helpfulness isn't still valued and respected by, the people who benefited from it.
The equity's still in the bank.
Right, yeah. Right. And no doubt that's what plays into, how does that person wind up, getting back, right? And so in 87, my brother, who's, my older, brother from my father's first marriage, right? He calls my dad because he was celebrating 1 year sober. And he says, Dad, I want you to come speak for me. And then my dad is like, okay, because he had helped get my brother Jimbo sober. Right? So now Jimbo's celebrating 1 year. He has no idea that my dad is out or has been out.
Right.
And so he says, okay, he agrees to go to the anniversary to speak for Jimbo.
And what year is this? Do you remember?
This is going to be 87.
87. So just as he's, okay. So that's maybe what got him back.
Yes.
Got it.
It is. Yeah, this is it. Yeah. So my mom takes him. Even though now they're separated and divorced and everything, my mom takes him and me and my father. We're sitting in a diner. I don't remember. This is his story. But we're sitting in a diner, and he's sitting at the table, and he describes the door. He looks out the door, and it was like the sun was setting, and someone had walked out the door, and now the door is softly closing. And as he's looking down the road, because you can look out the door and you can see down the road, like down the road a mile kind of thing. And he just says, run. Just run. Like you can leave now. Right? And the door closes all the way. And then he's looking at my mom and he's looking at me. And then he says, oh, shit. It's like, I got to get honest. And then he goes to the anniversary and tells everybody what he's been doing. And that's how he got sober again.
The truth will set you free. The truth will set you free. I wonder what was in him. Maybe it was divine intervention or what, that even though his mouth is saying run, why didn't he?
Yeah.
Probably
well, I mean, he says, right.
Mom, yep.
Yeah.
Wow.
So, yeah. And then, so now to take it all the way to, like I said, so now you're like looking at his story and when he has 8 years and me saying I'm proud of him, I haven't had anything to drink I haven't had any drugs or anything yet.
You're not experimenting yet.
No.
You're getting close to it, but you're not there yet. Yep.
Right. So a couple of years away. I probably had a healthy fear of it because of the recovery pedigree.
That was my experience. That was my experience early on at those years as well. Late start.
Yeah. Yeah. So I didn't start. And it's funny how we say late start and it's 15.
Well, late by these wacky standards here. Yes.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So 15 years old, I start drinking for the first time.
Okay. Yeah. That's about me. Same.
Yeah. And then, somewhere in here. And so let me so now again, I'm always thinking about families who are listening to the podcast and just family perspective. I think hopefully there's some value that you're receiving even in listening now, because you're thinking, well, I started drinking at 15 and you've heard me say that I got sober at 17. And so there's a huge reason for that, is because I did have two parents who were in recovery. Just because you might be listening and you might not have a problem with alcohol, you might not have a problem with drugs, but that doesn't mean that you can't be in recovery from something, that you can't have some experience, that you can't be modeling behaviors and creating a dynamic that's going to make it hard for addiction or alcoholism to continue in your home. And you can make things you can create an easier pathway for your child, for instance, to engage and begin a recovery journey if they do have a problem. So I hope that anyone listening can begin to see that, because that's what both of my parents did. And when I was 16 or so, early, so I'm only drinking I started drinking, I think, in April. I was like a month away from my 16th birthday. Yeah. And
9, because you're 83 kids, so that's 1999. Yep.
So early, somewhere, 3 months, maybe, I'm found out in a way, somehow, some way.
Or, of course you did, yeah.
And my father gets me on the phone. And it just in a curious way, he's just like, so have you ever drank? He's never asked me that question before, and I know that he must have info. He must have something on me, right? I know he's got me. He's got to have me dead to rights somehow, so I'm not going to be able to lie. So I'm like, well, yeah, I've had one before. And he was like, oh, that's great. He's like, that's great news, because now that you've had a drink, if ever you decide that you don't want to, you can come to meetings.
That's a beautiful response. Rather than the hand-wringing, the forbidden fruit, the shaming, all the places he could have taken that information. Yeah. And he took it someplace beautiful. Yeah.
Yep. So I think that's pretty instructive and pretty cool to look back on. That was his response. And it was an immediate seed of there's answer now.
There's the mustard seed right there. Yep.
Yeah. And because he knows that I haven't had one drink.
Of course not.
Right? He knows where this is likely going. So the fact that he just presents it that way, it's like you're seeding this possibility. And then, of course, all of the various things that he did along the way to help me. But what I'd like to get into is just kind of like when you come back to Rockaway and now I'm in recovery, and just what the experience was like, just mingling with Jimmy Doyle, in the community and all of that, and what some of the things that he shared and said and things along those lines.
No, of course. So like I'd mentioned, I moved back. I got intervened on in 1996 in November. My disease was cultivated and curated and stamped here in the Rockaways. And I got intervened on 2 days before Thanksgiving in 1996. Went out to Minneapolis for what I thought would be 28 days. And having bought in on the heels of that intervention, even before I landed in the treatment center, I kind of knew the jig was up. I wasn't 16 or 17. I was 28. So a little more tenderized, beaten into a state of reasonableness, if you will. So I went fairly compliantly, and what I thought would be a month, and I'll be back in Rockaway. And I knew there was a thriving recovery network. Joe C. was one of those younger members, and there was a handful of younger guys, Justin O.D., that I could have gravitated toward and plugged into. But, my aftercare recommendation was to stay in Minneapolis and go into sober living. And despite every instinct that I had, to want to come back to where it was comfortable, where it was familiar, where I knew people, where mommy was, whatever it was, something in me just said yes. And I went into that sober living facility for 6 months. And by that time, had developed a recovery network and a life and a friend group and a job and all these things that were kind of imperiled, if not completely gone, prior to that flight. And I wound up staying. I liked it so much, and I was staying sober, most importantly, that I stayed 3.5 years. So at about 3.5 years, I was given an opportunity by a family member to move back here to the Rockaways. I did my 3.5 years out in Minnesota, which I enjoyed, even went back to visit after. But it just felt like it was time to come home. And by that time, I was no longer threatened or felt uneasy about, well, I'm going to see the people, places, and things, and I'll be endangered. But I knew I was going to be able to hold that line more effectively if I dialed right into AA. So I did, that I made a meeting, I literally think my second day back, because that's what I did. I was a meeting maker at that point, and wandered into that GOD group on Saturdays at 12 noon down at the St. Rose basement. And I was struck by a few things with that meeting. Number one, the third step, the repetition of it. But to speak of the people, and more importantly, your dad, it was a very small core membership. It wasn't one of these raw 94th Street groups where there's 150 people at the anniversaries, and there wasn't all this pageantry. It was more drill down, grassroots, just, maybe 10, 15 people on a given Saturday, very granular. And I just responded to that. I liked the smaller group vibe. And your dad, again, we're all drunks, we're all equal, but he was the recovery alpha, if there is such a thing, if you can anoint somebody as the recovery alpha. And he wasn't an alpha simply because he was a bleeding deacon who told people what to do and how to do it and the way it used to be. To me, he emerged as a benevolent alpha, if you will, and just the fact that the way he composed himself, how calm he was, how humble he was. These were principles that just emanated from him, even without getting into too much verbal. And then when it came time to share his story, some of the details you went into earlier, he did it with a sense of gratitude, a matter-of-factness. That was a different guy. That was a guy you never met. It was a guy you didn't know. It was a guy I vaguely remember seeing, but kind of didn't know. And that's one of the beautiful things about recovery is you get this rebrand, even in a small area, a small geographic sliver of land where if you become one thing at one point in your life, that's it. You could live to 100, you're always going to be that thing. That AA and recovery gives us an opportunity to rebrand, not only in the less important community sense, but more pertinently in the family sense, for people who come in that already have families. And you see it at the anniversaries. I mean, how great are those first, second anniversaries where you see a wife or a gaggle of kids or a parent who's been impacted by the ravages of active addiction, and then just to see the sense of relief, the gratitude, the joy. I've had the privilege to share at a few and attend way more 1 year, 2 year anniversaries, and they're never not magical. So Jimmy to me became in very short order, just the serene sort of presence, a very welcoming presence at the GOD group. And then I want to double click a little bit on what his approach was on a more community level. There's a place, I believe it's still there, and I used to make jokes about. It's the Last Stop Cafe, Last Stop Gourmet, Last Stop Cafe. It's right by the subway station on 116th. Many post-AA meals are still taken there. But your dad, at any point, at any time of the week, any time of the day, could be seen outside that place in his Buster Marine jacket, literally doing boots on the ground 12-step work. Literally helping guys, regardless of age, whether they were your age or people that were his age and everyone in between, and doing it gently. And doing it with attraction rather than promotion, sharing some of his experiences. There's a gentleman, Chris Z, who you probably know, tall guy with the glasses. He's been around since 2005. He's super involved with the service in terms of the operation level. You've seen him. He's got a thing of keys because he's got the keys to every meeting. He does coffee at all the groups, big tall guy with the glasses. So he got sober in 2005, and he's a member of the GOD group still. And every now and again, I said earlier at the top how I tend to invoke Jimmy's name when I'm speaking, either at an anniversary or we're at a business meeting. Every time I talk to Chris about his history and when he showed up at GOD, which by the mid-2000s had migrated up to Fort Tilden, he always references how fond he was of your dad and how impactful your dad's approach with him. It wasn't this fire and brimstone kind of, this is what you need to do, and snarly, which, sometimes that could have been some people's approach, but his approach was welcoming. It was attractive. It was comfortable. And to this day, Chris Z, who now has 20 years, I think he just celebrates this month, actually, 05, he always references your dad as a pivotal figure in his early recovery. That's what we're all aspire to do, is to attract rather than promote, and by just sharing his experience. So I agree with it. I caught into it too. I mean, I wasn't a technical newcomer, But candidly, coming into Rockaway, I felt like a newcomer. The only person I really recognized from being out there was Bones. Beyond that, it was all these people I never met, I never drank with, and I felt new and, unmoored, if you will, a little bit, even though I was home. I wasn't in my recovery home yet. I was still finding my recovery home. And your dad was a paternal figure in helping me find that recovery home. You're talking about the Father's Day theme. Absolutely. He was the paterfamilias of certainly Rockaway AA, but in particular that GOD group.
Yeah. And it was, particularly helpful for me. I mean, really, like that degree of transformation, number one, is just profound. But it's not like that's not duplicatable. In fact, it's so repeatable. We see it so often.
All the time. Like these people like that are a little even more sober than I am today or than we are today. Like I think of these guys, like I only knew them sober, so I don't know what their rebrand was, but they tell you about what their rebrand became. But even then, just looking, back down the field, I talked about the 1 and 2 year anniversaries, but even someone with 10 years who you remember when they came in and, they've rebranded themselves and their family, certainly within the community. And I'm not saying you take an eraser to, the what it was like portion. In fact, that's pivotal, especially when, when you're on the keep it real. But you get to live literally 2 lives in one lifetime. And your dad is he's one of the more dramatic examples of that, but they're around us all the time. And it never isn't magic. It never doesn't strike me. And sometimes I lose sight of it even in my own story, like, because I'm too busy dealing with the day and trying to navigate today. And I forget, like, sometimes when I am in my defects too much or maybe a little disassociated from a higher power or whatever it is, and I'm almost regressing down the shade, not putting steps in my life as I should. And I get down to that last part and say, oof, let's get back to the fall of 96. That's the unseemliest, my personal brand with myself, my family, probably even in the community. That was the low point of my personal brand. And to take that and to reframe it through the help of other people, through the wisdom of these steps, and to have this completely unrecognizable life and station, 3 decades later. Again, it doesn't take 3 decades to happen. It can happen within a few months, quite candidly. And I get to watch it all the time. So, but to hear Chris, and your dad's been gone now 15 years. I mean, he told me this literally 2 months ago outside, like before the meeting, talking about, his first tentative steps into recovery and how your dad was such a pivotal figure and keeping it attractive to him. And your dad, and the reason he is such a service giant, and that's kind of what he's branded as Chrissy Service, was because he learned at the knee of your dad, who was the treasurer for our group for years. He chaired it for a little while because our core membership was super small. I was the chairperson for like 9 years and the treasurer, which I inherited from your dad in 2010 when he passed away. I inherited the treasurer, and not out of any sense of control or let me seize on it and get my arms around the money that we give away anyway. It wasn't that. But I had that treasury till 2024. 14 years I had the treasury. And that just speaks to how small the core membership, i.e. those who attend business meetings is.
Yeah. So, yeah. So if anybody isn't familiar, we're talking about like you're holding a whopping $37.80.
That's the prudent reserve. Yes.
Right. On a revolving basis for the last 14 years. So what would you say some of the, kind of like recovery takeaways or gems or, anything specific, like, because I could share one. When I first came in, because we were, sitting in a circle of beginners, and there's probably just, 10, 12 of us, and my father had the commitment, and this is what I was leading to before, like just how profound it was, but just how helpful it was for me personally, for whatever reason, how deeply I appreciated that both of my parents were sober people, that now I'm stepping into this world.
Which was the fall of 2000 at age 17, if I remember correctly.
Right. Yep. October 15th, 2000.
2000, yep.
Yeah. And I'm sitting in this circle and my dad is leading it. And so he talks for maybe 5-10 minutes, and then he's going to draw it out of you around the room. And again, there's only 10, 12 of us. We're sitting on the stage at St. Camillus, with the curtains drawn, so nobody can see what's happening back there. Yep. And he's just like, like this guy shares, and then he'd throw some feedback, which is like not really done that much, but like it's back then, it was so highly valued. There wasn't a single guy that was like, didn't appreciate that Jimmy was saying something. after they would
Less
talk.
sensitive times.
Yes, less sensitive times,
Yes.
right? And so I was talking about like my 17-year-old self and complaining about God knows what. And when I'm done, he said something and I was like, okay. He's like, you got to stop thinking about not drinking anymore and just focus on not drinking for 24.
Very tough to tell for a 17-year-old to wrap their head around that.
Yeah.
In Rockaway
and it was
Beach. Yeah.
The first, like the consideration of like, okay, so it's a one day at a time deal. And then having difficulty with why can't I just have one or a couple, And then he says, all right, so why don't you do this? He was like, go stand on some train tracks. Wait for the train to come and hit you and tell me if it was the first car or the last car that killed you.
It's always going to be the first.
And everybody starts laughing hysterically, and this was my dad in front of everybody,
His own kid.
And again, I just appreciate it. I just was like floored by the wisdom of it. Just looking at him, like that was really good, And then, further developing that in my own mind, because it's like everybody's laughing and it's like, I totally get it. But then saying like, well, what are you doing? Why would you step on the train tracks?
Why would you?
What are you doing on train tracks in the first place? And it was like, that was one of the first times I had my own kind of, thought, my own insight, where I was like, every morning, it's like we're waking up on the train tracks, or that we're waking up with decision of, I'm going to head in this direction. I have to head in this direction. I got to go this way. Am I going to do it on the tracks, or am I going to do it in parallel in this other, It reminds me of the phrase, like, regardless of how far down the road you get, you're always only 3 feet away from the ditch.
That's it. Yes.
Right? So you're moving in this direction, but in parallel, there's this possibility of this devastating thing that we could wind up doing over here.
It's always right there. We've all heard the testimonials, It's, none of us, and no one's immune,
Yeah.
He was, again, he had a way of putting things pretty simply. It was digestible, and people could, especially, a 17-year-old could kind of make sense of. But just his aura and his delivery, and the humility is really what I was always struck by. There was never any grandstanding, always just quiet, steady, there, reliable, always willing to help, like really super impactful. And for you, I remember when you came in at 17 with, both your parents in the rooms, like, never too soon. Like, you probably had isms long before you drank, and consequences pretty early on after only a short stint, but you certainly earned your seat. And I remember how well you took to it. Like, you were, doing commitments, and obviously taking your natural gift with the language and your inherent honesty and candor, and really, putting that in front of rooms full of adults. And having the confidence to do that, and I imagine probably was instilled by just the idea that, hey, well, my parents are here, like, I'm good. I know who's watching me, that kind of thing. Like, you would never, and it can happen to a lot of us, regardless of what age you come in here. Like, even when we come in at 30 or 40, we still feel like those insecure teens. But the fact that you were able to come in and know that you were like, amongst love, like actual hard, real love, unconditional love, just from those two people, that I think, in my mind, gave you a leg up. In terms of just feeling comfortable. And again, I was always struck by the wisdom and the insight that you shared at such a tremendously young age. That was, wise beyond your years in terms of that. The emotional access that you were able to provide to yourself was very uncommon, if not unheard of, for people of your vintage. And I always remember being struck by that.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, well,
thanks for that.
True. Absolutely. No, absolutely.
Yeah. And again, I think that's largely, in part to both parents. And these are, both parents divorced. Again, like he had relapsed on, he came in for alcohol and whatever other substances, but then he started using cocaine, which is something I think, I think that in reflecting upon it, right, things went a little bit haywire for him my mom is pregnant, and he had 2 boys in a previous marriage.
Yep.
And then he had 2 twin girls in another relationship, and he was in prison when they were born. And
that's a lot to parse.
Yeah. And so in prison when they were born, and there was another man who was in the prison with my father, and there was some speculation as to which of these 2 men was the father.
Oh, geez.
And so it became pretty clear that my dad was their father, right, as time went on. And this guy had come up with an escape plan. And when you're in prison, people who are, alcoholics and addicts, and then they wind up in prison, and then they kind of get themselves cleaned up and together because they're separated from substances. It's like now he has a chance to shine as the great guy that he is because he's not under the influence of the substances that he's addicted to, right? Mm-hmm. And so now he's got special privileges in the prison, and he's got responsibilities, which means he had access to certain areas that only certain people were allowed because you were respected and responsible. And so in order for this guy to escape, he needed my father to give him access to a couple of keys. Okay. And my father obviously, he refused and was like, you just had a little bit of time left. Why would you do that? And the guy said, if you don't help me escape, you'll never see your kids.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
So then, obviously, Dad helps the guy get out. A couple of guys get out of jail. They head for the Canadian border, and they're taking the girls with them.
Oh, my goodness.
So on the way to the Canadian border, the guy gets into a fight with the mother, throws them out on the side of the road. They get picked up in Canada or like at the border. The three guys that escaped wind up going back to jail or back to prison, but they just finished the remainder of their time, but my father got more time tacked on.
Because he helped them.
Yeah, aided and abetted an escape. Right. So they get out. This guy gets out before my father gets out. Because again, he just continued his sentence, whereas my father got more time added.
Right.
And then the guy
this stuff I never knew, and it's wildly fascinating.
Yeah. The guy gets out and takes the girls anyway, and they disappear. So they don't know. My father doesn't know where they are or what the situation is, and they did not track my father down until they were 29 years old.
I remember this kind of coming into your orbit. I remember this.
Right.
Yep.
And I was about 12 or 13 when they found my dad. Right. Like,
So right around the time of that, right around the time of that anniversary that he spoke at.
Right. He gets a phone call and it's like, is this Jimmy Doyle? Yeah. I'm your daughter.
Ooh.
Yeah.
Pre-23 and me.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
So when you take a look at all that from that perspective, right, like with these kinds of, who knows what the emotions can be when now you're about to have your fifth child, I don't know, like he winds up relapsing, and then he was out for that like kind of 4-year period until he, wound up back. Yeah. Yeah. And so I just feel like, and so the first two boys were my brother Jim, my brother Michael, and Michael, he contracted the HIV virus in the 80s. And then he wound up, I met him for the first time at my brother's anniversary.
Okay.
And like I had never met him.
The one that you referenced earlier? That anniversary you referenced earlier?
Correct. Yep. Correct. So I met Michael, my brother Michael, for like pretty much the one and only time that I could remember. And then it was a short time after that when I was probably 6 years old and I was watching, TV on one of the set box, like the dresser style TVs that are just like these giant, dressers
absolutely.
On the living room floor.
Require a football team to move them. Yes.
Yeah. And I'm sitting there eating a bologna sandwich and watching, like the Rockford Files or something ridiculous. And the phone rings. And, even as like a 6-year-old, like you can tell when a phone call is kind of different than your normal phone call and you don't know what's happening. And I look over at him and he's like listening. He's like, okay. And then he hangs up the phone and he has both his hands on the dining room table. He looks over at me and he says, your brother Michael is dead.
Oh, wow.
And then he just walks into the kitchen.
Oh, my goodness.
And we never talked about it again.
Ever?
No. Like
Ever? Till 2010, it never even came up. No emotional kind of...
No, I think like that was the kind of thing where it was just like him stoically just, eating that and probably like, and how difficult it must have been that like he didn't have the kind of relationship that he would have wanted to have with him. He spent all that time in prison. Mm-hmm. their whole childhood, right? So so again, like the rebrand that you're saying, the transformation, when you think about the stark difference between what my brother Jimbo and my brother Mike
Versus
and
you.
my sisters Karina and Pauline, and then me, right? Even with a relapse in the early days, because of my brother asking him to speak, that gave him a shot. And as soon as he came back in, he would, when he had 23 years sober, he's coming up on 23 years sober for his anniversary, he was diagnosed with cancer. So he was diagnosed cancer April of 2010, I guess, right?
I remember, it was a short stint, afterward,
Yeah.
Passed away in the summer, right? August? October, okay. Yeah.
Right.
I remember anniversary in August. I remember that. And I believe you and Alex spoke.
Right.
Yes, I remember that.
So, right. And it was at that anniversary.
August of 2010, yep.
Yeah, where he said something which was like really special and profound also, was like, I knew that if I was holding my son's hand, I was going to be okay.
Wow. That's profound. That's gonna land. Yeah, that's
so he was like he was saying about me, like 4 or 5 year old me, that it was like I was taking him to the meeting.
Right.
Wow. Yeah. So you mentioned like 1/16th, and like one of the profound, just like this is an aside, but I'm thinking about it since you mentioned it, that the people that he was helping on 116th Street, we're talking about low bottom alcoholics laying on the sidewalk next to pickles and pies, shirt up around the navel, like sunburned faces and bellies because the bellies are exposed, and, the red cheeks and the bloodshot, the blood vessels burst in their faces and things like that,
People that you say you want to help, but maybe you probably don't have the, kind of the bandwidth to do it. Right. You want to help them, but most of us candidly wouldn't. If they're easy to ignore, they're easy to discard, they're easy to just kind of move on to the next one, a more viable prospect, if you will. And to your point, go ahead. I'm sorry, but yes.
Well, yeah, but just like having the experience of him not only speaking with those people, but like inviting them, like we're going to a meeting. So talking to them, and then even just at that age, I guess from just seeing the interactions of that, to know it's like there's a place people go for help with this problem of drinking. There's a place people go. There's a place people can go to get help. And so like my 5-6-year-old self, like what is this guy sleeping on this sidewalk for? Why?
Yep. And why is my dad so willing to help him?
Yeah. But like, the answer to that question would be what I would discover myself. As soon as I started drinking, I was immediately like, well, I don't have a problem. Right. I'm not going to be like mom and dad. I don't need to do any of that stuff. I'm going to be fine.
I thought the same thing.
I'm going to figure this out. Yeah. Right. And so that's the nature of addiction. That's why that guy is on the sidewalk, because if you were to say, hey, do you want to come to the meeting with us? He could look up at us, sun in his face, and go, why would I do that?
Yeah, I'm good. Look at me. I'm clearly thriving.
Yeah, this isn't so bad.
Right. Well, that's when you're on the train tracks. It doesn't, until the train hits you really hard, it doesn't feel that bad. Well.
Yeah. And we are like incredibly resilient to be able to just like get hit, bounce off the tracks, and then come to and just get right back to it and just do that over and over again.
Despite mounting empirical evidence that it's not a good idea.
Yeah. And so when my father was explaining the idea of relapse he was a doorman, and there was a guy in the building. So this is just a normal person who doesn't really understand. And he says to my father, because my father must have explained to him, like what happened, that he was, getting sober now, probably because the guy was like, I don't know, had seen him on cocaine as a doorman. And was like, what, like, you're not doing it anymore. He's like, yeah, I was sober for a while. Then I went back and, and probably explained the whole story. And, like when you're talking to somebody who really doesn't understand alcoholism or addiction, and they're just like baffled, they're just like looking like, what? And the guy says to him, why would a person who was swimming in waters with sharks and piranhas and electric eels, make it through to the other side, get out of that water, and then turn around and just dive right back in. And there is no explanation for it.
Rational explanation. It'll be different this time. Shark's probably full. That piranha's missing a fin. Oh,
Yeah.
I've refined my stroke. You know? Yeah.
So
it's nighttime. They won't see me. Like whatever reasoning, you can rationalize it if you really want to go back in that water. There's a lot of places that our alcoholic brains trick us into thinking that it can become a good idea. And, we've heard them obviously ad infinitum, all the controlled drinking, it'll be different, the water in between the drinks, changing the friend group, in introducing or removing another substance that could impact it, whatever, getting a job, getting a relationship, like all these things will help me navigate drinking so I won't drink that way. But if you drink that way, if you're wired like we're wired, regardless of all those wonderfully intentioned hacks, you're still going to drink how you drank. It's been proven time and time again. And, the Boweries and the cemeteries and the divorce courts and the jails are littered with people who thought that this swim was going to be different, that the shark was going to be hungry, that, my stroke is enhanced, that it's going to be different this time. And I'm grateful, and I'm sure you are, and so many of us are, and your dad came to this realization, obviously your mom too, like that it'll never be different. It'll never be different. It just isn't. You can, delude yourself all you want and reframe it and cast it in a seemingly different, more flattering light. The fact of the matter is it'll never be different. The power of craving, the phenomenon of craving, the allergic reaction, it'll never be different. And I'm grateful that I personally was able to come to that realization and wholeheartedly with every cell in my body to know this will never be different. This will never be certainly not as good as it was in the beginning, because it was probably for all of us in that magic period, but that the jig was up. And when I came to realize that the jig was up, no matter what I tried or didn't try, to come to that full place of acceptance that I've been, God willing, every single day since 1996. Like, there's a lot of stuff I've been unable to accept and have suffered as a result of it, whether that was something circumstantially or professionally or interpersonally, like, things that I can't accept are the things that bother me. The fact that I've fully accepted that it'll never be different, that I'm just bodily wired, that I cannot drink safely, that hasn't had any power on me because I accepted it fully. So that's what I strive for every day is, all these 24s later, is if something's got me feeling a certain way, to find my way towards acceptance. And obviously that takes a lot of forms, yeah.
And so the solution then, right? The spiritual journey. What I can say about my father is that it was as though there was a consistent, gradual increase in his spiritual conditioning, his presence. It was already profound, right? Like, so when I was 17, it was already like you just you just struck.
He exuded something. Yes.
Yes. Yes.
Yep. And only continued to in the intervening, I guess 10 years from when you came in till 2010. Yes. Right. It evolved. It evolved. Yes.
So I'm asking this question as a curious observer, not as even a son and a father, and like where it's like, tell me about like my dad, just the experience of like, if you're observing this man, what is the explanation for that? How did that happen? That exude was the word that was a perfect word choice because I couldn't find it. That is what it was. He exuded a spiritual presence that grew over time.
It did. I mean, I saw him. I was around him for those same 10 years you were, because again, I moved back in April. You came around in October. So in terms of his recovery, Jimmy, you watched over those 10 years. And I think anybody like him who has that aura around them, that's not by accident. It's not like putting on a shirt. It's literally the result of boots on the ground work, whether that's work with meditation, in his case, work with newcomers, maybe newcomers that others would have not considered or not engaged with. So that, to me, that level of spirituality that was apparent in a crusty old Irish guy with a satin jacket on, exuded this Buddha sort of calm, and he did. Like, I never once saw him rattled. even though things could be tough in his personal life, or he was going through this or he's going through that. He always was at a baseline. And that's obviously, I think, the goal for all of us. It's probably why we drank in the first place, is to achieve some sort of baseline where you're sort of insulated from that level of agitation. And to me, the only way to get there is, it's not, certainly we've proven it can't be imbibed, right? Occasionally we'll think ourselves into thinking that it can be purchased. God bless Jimmy D, but he was not swimming in money, right? You think it can be worn like a cool shirt. No, because you have to change your shirt every day. You think it's something that you can borrow from somebody else, maybe for a little bit, but not sustainably. The only way to achieve that I've seen, and I've seen it in my own experience, I've seen it in others, and certainly saw it in your dad, is literally do the work. To literally do the work. I mean, rare was the time I ever went to a meeting that he wasn't there, right? I talked about your mom the other night. 50 years, celebrated a few months ago, I believe in February. 50 years sitting in a meditation meeting in a darkened room in the St. Rose basement, same place that housed GOD, where I met your dad again back in April 2000. Here we were in that same room. And here's your mom sharing candidly, honestly, obviously insightfully, but doing the work. She got asked to speak and she said yes. You know, I want to tell a quick story about your mom. Just, I know this is a Father's Day thing, but just about the level of grind and commitment that never ends, that helps you achieve that attractive sort of humility. And again, the only way to do it is to do it. So a couple of weeks ago, I had the privilege of leading an anniversary at the GOD group. Two of our celebrants were, there was a 12-year anniversary, two young ladies, a 12-year anniversary and a 6-year anniversary. Great. I got the opportunity to lead that anniversary. I was very honored. As I was walking into that meeting, your mom had told me that she was out at a meeting in Long Beach, the Early Risers meeting, at 6:30 a.m., where I believe she might have met her husband, Jack, in the way back. Yep, at that same meeting. Yep. So that was at 6:30 a.m. on Saturday, 2 weeks ago tomorrow, that she had been at an anniversary where 21 celebrants had, received coins. Great. That's at 6:30 a.m. on a Saturday. Now it's noon, and here's mom walking in, to watch to participate in this celebration of recovery. A couple of women of grace and dignity who they all aspire to be. They always talk about it. Your mom being among the North Stars in that regard, right? So that was the noon meeting. Great. And Paul McHugh, another grinder, doing the work, lots of years, lots of, high profile sobriety, still doing the work, boots on the ground. He was there too. And he had spoken at the anniversary in Long Beach that morning. Okay, great. So there's the anniversary. I shouted them out saying how impressive that I was. Like a lot of us had. I made a meeting at 6:30 a.m. I'm good. The day is good. So here they are at noon. That same night at the Rockaway Survivors Group, which I've seen you at not too long ago, I had the privilege once again of speaking on behalf of Mike J, celebrating his 18 years. And I'm up there in front of the room, and who's in the crowd? Same day, Debbie F, with her 50 plus years, third meeting of the day. Paul McHugh had just watched his wife celebrate 8 hours earlier, right there in the front row, right? And to me, and this was your dad, right? Like, you're never done. These are North Stars, like people who are living life sober, productive lives of worth and value that are attractive. And how do they do it? There isn't really, it's not that much of a secret. I watched in a 12-hour window from what I heard and what I saw, how they do it. You just keep doing it. And that was your dad. He just kept doing it. He'd go on retreats. We went on outgoing speaking commitments. He engaged with the often unengageable, let's be candid. And as a result, you win that level of aura that he projected. Again, it's not put on. It's not a mask. It's not something you can buy, sniff, eat, drink. It's earned through, discipline and that repetition. So that's something I always aspire to, that regardless of what the day is, whatever the day looks like just keep doing the deal. And you too, at some point, whether you realize it or not internally, can project as this shining example of what that work can yield, just in terms of being well-adjusted in our own skins, which is what we probably always sought in the way back when we were 15 or in some cases 12 or 11.
Right. Yeah. The word he would use all the time is routine. He was big on routine, and he had a daily routine, and he would say that if he woke up in the morning, if his eyes opened and his feet hit the floor and he hadn't prayed yet, he knew he was off.
That's routine. That's commitment to the routine. That's knowing when you're routine. If it becomes so routine, that's when you know it becomes routine. When it's not followed, you know it's off. So that means that you've established a routine.
Yeah. But to think about how he like when you're talking about meditation or mindfulness, and, you know, one of the early practices in getting into that is like you just breathe and you're just going to do whatever the mantra is, whatever the thing is. And then when you notice that your mind has wandered, you just come back to the breath. And so it's part of the process. It's not, oh, I'm doing it wrong because I lost my train of thought. It's like, no, you're going to lose your train of thought. It's how successful can you be at coming back to the breath. His routine was so solid that his feet would hit the floor. We're talking about eyes open, wake up.
That's solid.
Yeah. The first thing he would do is pray. Eyes open, he'd start praying. So that if his feet hit the floor and he hadn't prayed yet, he knew, like, okay, something is off. And so it's just like, and come back to it.
Yeah.
I've noticed, he would notice within the first 10 seconds of his day.
Well, that's because the routine was so hardwired. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. No, and me personally, I literally open eyes first thing right before I reach for the parliament is thank you. And sometimes I mean it. Oftentimes I may not. But that's so hardwired into me that literally thank you is my first utterance of the day. Just based on routine. Again, felt harder and more impactfully some days than others, but it's just in me, you know. So establishing a good routine, you know, a routine of obviously of meditation, prayer, meetings, like, you know, a routine exercise, whatever that good routine is, follow it. And then follow it to the point where if you don't, you feel off. And then to course correct. You know, we get to start our day over. We hear that all the time. You get to start your recovery over. And the breath that's the most basic, elementary component of all this, because without it, none of us are continuing. So, that was actually something your mother mentioned the other night during the meditation meeting. Yeah. Yep.
Yeah. And the service element, that, you know, the breath bringing you to just being of service and being able to help others and being able to flow. You know, like where it's not like Jimmy Doyle is saying something that is, you know, profound to help. It's more of like what he's channeling almost.
Mm-hmm. He's channeling something that's greater than any of us individually. Actually, you know what? I didn't see a ton of him in those last couple of months, but I want to, not to get morbid, but this could be something that's helpful. Like, all right, so, you know, we use our spiritual toolkit to help navigate challenging situations, whether they're familial, work-related, money-related, whatever, health-related. So tell me what some of your takeaways were, not to turn this isn't an interview, this is a conversation. I want to see what some of your takeaways were as he was grappling with what he had to know was probably a death sentence, and how were the principles and the basics and the routine, while the routine was probably compromised to a degree, I imagine it had to have been. How did he show up for that? How did he navigate that? And I don't know if it makes you emotional, I apologize, but so what?
Emotions are fine.
Yeah, I still want to know, like, what was, because I didn't see him as much in those last few months. And again, he got diagnosed in April, and was gone in August. So there wasn't a long run. October, right? August is when he celebrated, right?
So the only thing that I would say, and again, this is just the program in action, is that he had, like, you know, the minor day-to-day irritations, right? Like of like being compromised in this way and not being able to do some of the things, you know, that you're typically doing. But so he had some irritations like that, but still his demeanor was unchanged. His, you know, I remember my impatience. So I probably will get emotional, and we'll make it through it, John.
It's fine.
You know, he had chemo twice a week. And there was no way that he couldn't drive anymore, right? Which he was a big guy that drove all over the place, right?
Yes.
Yeah. And so now you got to have people who are going to like take you. But this is what's wonderful about the recovery community is my mom puts out an email, like a request to everyone, you know,
I remember this.
Jimmy's going to need rides to meetings.
I remember this. And to treatment sometimes too, right?
Yeah. Wherever it was, he was going to need rides to, you know, and that it's going to be 2 or 3 times a week or whatever it is. And we need, some people. Would anybody be available? And there was a wait list.
There you go.
That's the community, like that's what you can get as a, like a lifelong benefit to this is like, there's not, I was a firefighter and it comes close. Like being a firefighter comes close as far as camaraderie and as far as like people stepping up. But, this is what's funny about like that is that it's not selfless though necessarily. It's like, like I got to show up to do this. It's like
it's
obligated.
your job. It's your job.
I'm obligated to show up and move
that's what the money's. Yeah.
He's a senior guy,
Right,
that kind of thing, And so you're showing up and of course it's better for you to show up and to be helpful than not. And so you get the benefits of it and being around people. But the selflessness of our community, people in recovery, is like really profound in that way. And so I was impatient. And I could just remember him, like me taking him to treatments and like him just getting out of the car and just, like he's moving slower and, but like same kind of just like calm, peaceful, expression, going through this and cracking jokes with people and, telling jokes all the time. Always like wanting to laugh, tell jokes. And there was one experience where he was up in the apartment and I came to pick him up for a treatment. And I said, all right, Dad, I'm here. And he's like, Chris, I'm not going. And I'm like, come on, Dad, you gotta go. And now it's like a 5-minute back and forth, like a pep talk of me trying to get him to come downstairs. And so after this back and forth, he says, okay, fine. And then it takes a while. He finally comes down. And on 117th Street, his building, if you know that block, it's like the garage. It's like a descending garage. It's like, you go down quite a bit. He comes out the side door. He's at the bottom of the hill. He comes walking out and he is like skin and bones. This is August.
Yep.
And I'm like, oh my God. Like I'm looking at him try to make it up this hill of this descent of the garage. And I'm just like, he's not going to make it. It's like, jump out of the truck, go run down. I like grab him. So like just the fact that he was like still like I'm going like, okay, fine, and like going through the motions and like smart feet. He was so sick, John.
Yes, I remember. Yeah. And that's hard to see. Yeah.
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 So he went and he wound up going into the hospital that day. So basically, if I don't pick him up and get him downstairs and get him where he needed to go, we put him in an ambulance 45 minutes later. He probably wouldn't have made it. Mm-hmm. So that ambulance ride led to him sticking around. And then that's when he celebrated that anniversary, his final anniversary.
Yes, in August.
Where he talked about me holding his hand and taking him to meetings. And so, all the way through, all the way to, to the end, same demeanor as far as what I saw.
Yep. That's unsurprising.
And, I was with him while he was still like coherent. And I remember, so the last time I talked to him, when he was still, able to talk, I'm saying, all right, Dad, I got to go. I got to go because I'm meeting a guy. I'm doing some work with him tonight.
Carrying on the legacy. Smart, yeah. Doing the work. That's the last time you saw him?
It's not the last time I saw him, but it was the last time that he had a conversation with me. Okay. He was then out of it after that.
Yep. So what did he say? Do you remember what he said when you told him you were going to meet a guy?
No, I don't know that I know the words that he said, but of course, just a contented sort of, yeah, of course. Okay. Love you,
doing what you were taught. Right?
Yeah. No expectation that I would be sitting there with him while this guy needs help and is waiting to meet with you, know? So it didn't dawn on me until right in this moment that was actually the last conversation I had with him.
Conscious interaction, yep.
Yeah, I left him to go help a guy.
I love that.
Yeah.
I love that. Any chance you remember who that guy was?
Yeah, I know exactly who it is. We're still working on him.
Okay, good. That's hopeful.
Yeah.
Some are quicker than others.
Yeah, he's had some ups and downs, but we're still working on him.
Good. Good.
He's still alive. How about that?
That's a start.
Yeah. Yeah. So I was able to give the eulogy. And so in closing, I just want to say how, because of recovery and because of, I got to hang out in a lot of the same places that my father hung out. And I wouldn't have had it any other way. And I have two parents that, when you think about as a teenager saying, I want to be just like them.
That's rare.
Exactly. And it's rare because of recovery.
Yep. Yeah, no, it's a way of life. It's a place to aspire. It's a way to aspire to be. And, you were fortunate more than most in that you had these two, I'll say it, two giants of the sober community to model the behavior, which you continue now all these decades later. What is this, 2000? So you probably just turned 42 is my guess. Mm-hmm. And that's basically your why, right? I mean, even as a family guy and young kids and, having dealt with some really difficult stuff along the way. It's not to say that your journey has been perfect, but it's always been rooted in what's the mission at hand, which is to help the next guy or the next family, or the next suffering addict. And that is how you win that baseline aura of attraction, of being well-adjusted, and that you can navigate anything provided you adhere to the routine and continue to do the work. And that's messaging that your dad certainly embodied. And, you're fortunate your mom is a very young woman, still doing it and still doing it at an impactful, high level. And you're luckier than most that you got to see that up close, But it's easy to take those lessons and just sit on them or squirrel them away or do nothing with them. But you've taken them parlayed that into a way of life, which to me is something I'm super proud of, from the remove that I watch you at, having met you as as an adolescent and watching you as a man in full who's literally continuing the mission. That's super admirable and noble and something that needs to be said. So happy Father's Day to you.
Oh, well, thank you very much. And happy Father's Day to you also. And no coincidence, today is Debbie F's birthday. So
right after Founders Day. There you go. So she turned 90 on the 10th. Today's June 13th. I know she's not 90, but I imagine probably somewhere in the 70 range, 71.
Yeah. Well,
right?
She got sober at 20 years old.
I did the math, so I figured, So she's probably 71 today is my guess. Yeah. So She looks amazing. She sounds even more amazing. And she is somebody that, I'm sure you're honored to call her a mom, but consistent with the theme of fatherhood and the role that can play in not only trickling down the gene, let's be honest, right? It trickles down the gene.
Right.
But if you're fortunate enough, and we'll close with this, or I'd like to close with this in terms of what the impact recovery had. So you were fortunate enough that you from age 4 till 27 for you had a sober, programmed dad. My dad passed away in 2015. I was there while he took his last breath. He had periods of white knuckly sobriety, a lot of not so much, but the only time in my life that he was sober, meaning like recovery sober, meeting sober, was from, I'm going to say the summer of 77 until like May of 79. So for me, that's ages, 9 to 11, and that, an impactful age in any young person's life, 9 to 11. And would you know that I'd say 80 to 90% of my paternal memories literally come in that window. Not a coincidence. And again, he lived a mile away. It's not like he was in another state or in another neighborhood. He lived a mile away, yet the most interaction, and my parents divorced very young, just like yours, the most interaction, the most memories, the most experiences that I had on the come up until we began to drink together. That's a different narrative, but I'm talking as a young man in need of a father and time with that father came during the, nearly 2-year window that he was an active member of Alcoholics Anonymous. The only 2-year window that I can remember. So there's something to that. So when it comes time to showing up for my children, as yours, in a meaningful way, I want to remain an active member of Alcoholics Anonymous, do the work, stick to the routine. So when they're looking back, whoever knows when, on some AI-generated podcast, 30 years from now, I want them to be able to say that, my dad showed up, not because he was awesome, not because he was great, because that's not what this is, because he stuck to his routine and he lived the program. And he was a beneficiary of this now 90-year-old gift that we get to enjoy. So I'm really grateful that, you asked me to participate today, and, much love to Jimmy D, or Jimmy Doyle, we can say his last name. And when it's time for me to share at the GOD group on Saturday, and it's a show of hands, so I might share, don't be surprised if I find a way to weave what we've discussed today into my share on Saturday, just because it's warranted on this Father's Day weekend.
Yeah. Well, please do.
Yes,
And thank you so much for doing this, John. This was really awesome. I could not have asked a better person to allow me to go through all of this history as best as I could. You
Best as I could,
it,
yeah.
and you really made it special and allowed me to get a little misty-eyed here every once in a while.
Even better.
And so thank you so much. I really appreciate it, buddy.
Thank you. Much love to you, kid. I appreciate the opportunity and look forward to seeing you at the next meeting.
Will do.
Love you, kiddo.
Take care. Love you.
Bye-bye.